Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the third session of the Women's Homelessness Stream, Advocacy and Action for Women and Gender Diverse Housing Justice. I wanted to acknowledge that we are gathering here in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence and stewardship of these lands continue to this day. My name is Stefania. I'm the Executive Director of Advocacy and Public Affairs at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. I'm so honored to introduce today's session, which is packed. It's comprised of one panel and two presentations, all centered around advocacy and action to address housing justice for women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people. First, we'll begin with the panel She, They, Us, Making Room in Housing with Andrea Reimer and Ange Valentini from the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, Donnie Rosa of Atira Women's Resource Society, and Jody Gray of Aoki House Ross Supportive Housing. We'll also then follow up with Making the Invisible Unavoidable, a research and advocacy case study on getting women's homelessness on the political agenda with Jennifer Gordon and Roz Gunn of YWCA Cambridge. And then we'll follow up with Ontario Coalition of Women's Supportive Housing and Shelter Service Providers with Sumi Chang from Street Haven at the Crossroads and Corey Roslin of Elizabeth Fry Society. We'll hold all questions to the end so we can make time for everyone to do their panel and presentations. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Reimer. My pronouns are she, her, and I will be your moderator for the panel part of today's session. So we're here today representing, as you heard, the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing. It's a national project focused on ensuring housing policies across Canada include and prioritize responses that recognize the specific circumstances of women, girls, two-spirit, gender diverse people, and their children. Since coming together in 2017, the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing has successfully facilitated urgent and timely discussions, which have inspired our flagship calls to action. The website is there on the slide, so if you're interested, you could go and look at them, but maybe I shouldn't have sent you all to look at your phones right now. But you will see in the call to actions that they were negotiated in annual gatherings that the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing has been holding with people with lived experience of homelessness and housing precarity and the organizations that serve them. And then we bring these calls to action to governments through a variety of ways. But over the last couple of years, what we figured out is that we need a lot more people talking about this. So we have really doubled down on strengthening and amplifying the voices of women and gender diverse people with lived experience of housing and housing precarity and homelessness across Canada as advocates for better housing. And we do that in so many different, we have tried many things, from in-person organizer trainings, training the trainers, training trainers, and also podcasts, which is the card that we put on your chairs that we hope that you'll check out to hear directly from the people that are on the front lines of this crisis. So we're here today because we need your help. I would love to see a room full of men, in addition to all the people in the room who don't appear to be men, because really we need everyone in the room if we're going to be able to solve this. I've got three folks here who's going to give you the information you may need to help others move from interest to action for women, girls, two-spirit, and gender diverse people. We're going to start with Donnie Rosa, who's CEO of Atira, one of Canada's largest housing providers for women, children, and gender diverse folks fleeing violence. Donnie, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. It's very nice to be here with everybody today. I believe it's on. Yeah.
It's good? Yeah.
Okay. Tested. I want to start with a couple of facts that I think we all get so many, stats and details and stuff. So I thought I would stick with just two or three. So according to the State of Women's Housing Needs and Homelessness in Canada report released in 2020 by the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, over 9,000 women and girls in Canada experience homelessness on any given day. You probably already know this. That's why you're here. Over 1,000 women and their children are turned away from violence against women's shelters on an average day. And of course, most of those women and children go back into the situations where they were victims or receiving abuse. A research brief on housing needs for gender diverse people in Canada commissioned by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate in 2023, tells us that over 43% of gender diverse folks reported experiencing discrimination from their landlords and/or property managers on the basis of gender. When we put all of this together, we recognize that we are not serving these communities. Atira provides over 3,000 units of housing in BC. Annually, we serve over 10,000 women, children, and gender diverse folks who are fleeing violence, with over 24,000 hours of direct support to the people that we serve. And yet we still can't meet all the needs, and we turn people away on a regular basis. We provide services in BC, and our focus is in Vancouver's downtown east side, walking alongside some of our community's most vulnerable folks, supporting them on their journey, not on the journey that some system tells them they need to be on, not on the journey that we think they need to be on, but we provide them support and care and understanding on the journey that they decide they are on. I think it's really important to recognize that, because in so many ways, we still face the colonial systemic barriers that we don't recognize because we grew up in them. And so understanding people and meeting them where they're at and walking alongside them versus telling them what their dream or their hope should be is way more effective. And even with that, we don't always get it right. I think it's really interesting. Today I've heard a lot of folks, I was at a panel, I think it was called a manel, actually, where there were a group of men who were politicians. That wasn't my term for it. And they were talking about housing as though it was doors and windows and roofs. And I didn't hear them talk about the success comes in the services that wrap around people. And the success comes in putting those spaces in communities where people belong. And I think it's important for us to remember that it's not just the walls and the doors and the windows, but it's the community that we provide and the community that we're part of as service providers. I think it's important that we recognize that humans are complex and that our services can't just be siloed, and our way of funding can't be siloed. We know that if you fit into this neat little box, you can get funding here. If you fit into this one, you can get funding here. But if you cross into that, it becomes complex and delayed. So speaking of complexity, of the 1,800 or so staff at Atira, we're proud to say that approximately 78% identify as having lived experience. Our goal is to be over 80%. And it's my privilege to introduce Jody Gray, who identifies as having lived experience. Jody's on our panel today. She is the manager, the program manager at Aoki Ross, Canada's first supportive housing for transgender folks. And we run this in partnership with the City of Vancouver and BC Housing. Aoki Ross has 23 units of housing and a wait list of over 100 folks. So it's one of 2 transgender housing offerings in Canada, one of 2. That's kind of shocking. Jody, by the way, gave me permission to share her lived experience, and she's going to share more about that. She's been the manager there since its opening over 3 years ago, and with that, it's my absolute privilege to walk alongside you, Jody Gray.
Thank you, Dan. So when they asked me to speak about lived experience and the importance of lived experience, a couple of stories came to mind right off. The first one was when I was recovering from some mental health struggles. I went to a peer group for trans people, and I was talking about making changes to the mental health system to prevent some of the mistreatment that I had while I was going through the system. And I wanted to make the system more trans-friendly. Well, people at the peer group told me that I had to be a politician or have letters behind my name in order to make real changes. And I took that as a challenge. I don't like that message going to people, and I took it as a personal challenge to prove them wrong. So I started a research project that I was the lead on. I didn't need an academic to lead the project. I did it myself. I recruited an academic and a person from high management in CMHA to assist me, not me assisting them. And I showed that it can be done. I managed to get funding, I managed to complete the project, and showed that an ordinary person could do it. And that's what I have been trying to do, is show that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. So a few months ago, I got into housing 3 years ago, and most of my advocacy has been towards trans housing since then. A few months ago, I was invited to a meeting in a hotel, a room very similar to this. It was full of doctors and nurses and executives from housing companies. BC Housing was there. And we spent all day in small groups talking about how to fix gaps in the mental health and substance use services. And we swapped groups all day and had a very nice lunch. And everybody was happy at the end of the day. We got some great ideas. And they asked me at the end of the day to get up and give my impressions of how the day went and what I was going to take home with me. I stood up and I was totally honest. I said that I look out at everybody here and some very smart people, but I don't see anyone representing the people that I support on the downtown east side, the people that are falling through these gaps. And until you have those people at the table, you're going to guess at what the gaps are. You're not going to serve the people until you have the people come and tell you what they need, what they want you to do, and what they need to help them. So that is definitely the value of lived experience. And I think the last thing that I have to say is just that, well, first of all, with the letters behind the name, we should be adding letters behind people with lived experience. We should have the letters ELE behind each person, excellence in lived experience. So they I would have a major in mental health. I know plenty of people that would have a major in housing, and that's the ones that you want at the table. They're equals to everybody that is at the table. That's a politician, that's an academic. We need the equal voices. We don't need to downplay anyone that's at the table now, but we need to bring the people to the table that need to be there. And I was asked as part of this panel, when I realized my voice was making a difference. So I've had the great opportunity to speak a lot about this. I did a TEDx talk a few weeks ago, and it really hasn't hit me until Ange emailed me a couple of weeks ago and told me that I was going to be on this panel. But it really hit me then. Before, like with the TEDx, with the managing Aoki Ross House, I'd always downplayed my part in it. And I always looked at it as something that fell into my lap. And I was just lucky to be able to do it. But when Ange emailed me, it really, really hit me that people are seeking me out. People want to hear from people with lived experience. And my voice is making a difference. And I hope it makes a difference for a lot of people with lived experience that they can do this too. So maybe we're not all ordinary. Maybe we're all extraordinary to start with. And we can do extraordinary things, no matter what letters you've got behind your name.
Nice, thank you, Jody. So unlike Jody, I did actually run for office. I was told similar things. If you want to make change happen, you got to run for office. It's definitely not where I started, though, or where I planned on being. We're listening to Donnie's statistics. It's like the greatest hits of my life. I was born to an Indigenous mother, apprehended and put in the foster care system, eventually adopted, left home, got involved in sex work and drugs and other things, living on the streets. I think probably a little bit unusually, I got politically active. I mean, most of the people around me were not going to like political debates, or I mean, these were back in the days where you couldn't just go on TikTok or Google it. You had to like go to these things. And it's interesting when I think about Jody talking about extraordinary, it seemed fairly obvious to me that we had sort of two options. We either had ordinary people and sometimes just plain old bad people trying to convince them to do extraordinary things, or we could elect extraordinary people and just have them do what they would otherwise do, right? And to me, it just seemed like the place to put my energy. And so I worked on about 24 campaigns. It turns out running for office is a lot harder than it looks. I didn't personally run, but I tried and failed many times to get other people elected. And then I eventually, more to prove a point, ran myself and surprised myself by winning. It wasn't like commanding win. I won by a couple of dozen votes with over 250,000 votes cast in the election. So it was at last poll. It happened to be the university poll, yay universities. And I got elected. And so I spent 4 terms in government in Vancouver, starting with the Vancouver School Board. I was the first person elected with the Green Party in Canada, and then went on to spend 10 years at Vancouver City Council, including a good chunk of that as deputy mayor. So it's been a long road to go from the beginning of that story to the deputy mayor's office. But the line that really ran through it for me is power. I've had the stick of power used against me. I worked in nonprofits for a long time, trying to wrestle that stick out of the hands of the people that were holding it and point it in a better direction. And I got to hold it for a good chunk of time in elected office. And it's given me a lot of time to reflect on those of us who perceive ourselves as not having power have so much more than we think we do. And the people who perceive themselves as power actually don't have much. And the power they have is quite brittle. But because the rest of us don't see our own power, they get to sit on mantles and use it in ways that aren't always super constructive. So as I said in the opening remarks, the reason women, girls, two-spirit, and gender-diverse people experience more invisible, extreme, and violent forms of homelessness is because of power differentials. That's it. That's the whole story. It's not a complicated one. So ending homelessness is going to require many things, and we're going to talk a lot about them at the conference, but ending homelessness for women, two-spirit, gender-diverse people is an impossible task without a power shift. So building more power starts with making room for more voices. It's why we've focused on training women and gender diverse people to tell their stories. The thing you're going to remember from this panel is not me cracking jokes, it's going to be Jody's experience that you're going to remember. It's why we've tried to create platforms like the She, They, Us podcast so that folks who have lived experience can speak to larger audiences, and I would encourage you to listen and share it. And it's why we wanted to congratulate the Canadian Alliance for Ending Homelessness on adding this stream on women's homelessness. But it doesn't end there. The people using their voices and sharing the stories of some of the worst moments of their lives need to see that their truths turn into your action. And I know many of you are already doing a lot. It's figuring out how we can turn that lot into catalyzing the many taking that lot of action. So I'm going to turn it over to Ange Valentini to tell you what that action can look like.
Hi everyone, thanks Andrea. It's a real honor to be here today. My name's Ange Valentini. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm here today as an organizer and as a feminist housing advocate. And my own housing journey has been a little bit like snakes and ladders. It's mostly been stable, but I was a teenage single mom, and I remember juggling trying to go to school and having a quilt of part-time jobs and trying to make rent when the hydro bills were unexpected. And then my life got stable and things were good for a long time. And then I found myself navigating precarity again when I needed to leave a very volatile, dangerous partner with my 3 kids. And even though I had a really good job in government as a chief of staff, which sounds like a power position, it really the power differentials that women face, and gender diverse people and their families trying to find safety and trying to stay safe, are really challenging. And so I bring my own lived experience of the complicated factors that come into play to my advocacy work, but I also know that my story is just one story, and there's hundreds of thousands of experiences, and good public policy needs to reflect a broad range of perspectives. The Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing has 6 key calls to action. I want to tell you a little bit about them today. Basically, they've been negotiated over a long time. Andrea mentioned that in the beginning. It's a group of women and gender diverse people with lived expertise from across the country who've come together to share what they have in common, what the biggest kinds of change that might make a difference. One is to update the National Housing Strategy. I know the Minister of Housing was here today, and he talked about the National Housing Strategy. Canada didn't have one for a long time. The one we have now is definitely better than nothing, and it also has a long way to go. So we need housing policy that prioritizes investments for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit housing, and centered in the needs of women, gender diverse, and two-spirited people and their children. We also need to just prioritize money for housing that supports women, gender diverse people, and their children. We also need flexible, sustainable operating funding for the organizations that serve women, gender diverse people, and their families. And yeah, that's a big problem, and there hasn't been a lot of growth or sustainability in the way we fund not-for-profit services in Canada at all. And ultimately, what we really need is probably a universal basic income that actually gives people the power to make choices and to be able to afford things in their lives. Our quick calls to action are that your voices are needed to end homelessness. And actually, Minister Fraser said that this morning in his remarks, and I think they were echoed later in the Mantle by Blake Desjardins. His comments were refreshing, but it was shocking to me that we heard from 4 or 5 elected officials today in rooms that I was in, and not one, like every single one of them was a man. So we need to do better. And when we elect women, we get better decisions. Yeah. My favorite example of that is Olivia Chow was elected mayor of Toronto, and literally the first action of Toronto City Council after her election was to declare gender-based violence an epidemic in Toronto. So it was immediate change. It's lasting change. It's powerful. And actually all of you have the power to make lasting change in a million different ways. And there's a QR code there. The QR code will take you to the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing website. We've got an easy clickable letter to members of parliament. You can click and sign. It'll go to your mayors, it'll go to your premier, it'll go to your housing minister. So that's the low-level activism, but there are bigger ways you can be involved. The National Housing Council has a beautiful example launching right now that shows the difference in what happens when you center public policy and public institutions in the needs of women, gender diverse people, and people with different lived expertise. The next review panel is starting, and it's called NEHA. And the panel is being led by Sylvia Miracle, Marie Marino, and Pamela Glade DeRoche. And they specifically want to hear from women, gender diverse people, and their children about their lived experiences, trying to access your right to safe, adequate, affordable housing. Because the government has a duty to uphold that. And they're creating spaces across the country for both oral sharing, in-person sharing, online sharing, as a way that you can bring your stories. You can also be advocates who convene other women and gender diverse people in your networks and ensure that their voices get on the public record, to hold our government accountable, to make our governments do better in meeting the needs of our communities. I do want to tell you that NEHA is hosting a meet and greet on Thursday morning right here. So it's at 10 a.m. It's in room 108. I'll be there. I hope to see all of you there. I hope you will bring 5 people with you, because it actually takes, you tell two people and we tell two people, and then we all that's how we bring the noise, and that's how we get change.
And everyone gets buttons.
Well, everyone in this room already has a button. Okay, so I'm calling on you to be an activist, but ultimately, I also want you to know you're not alone. There's lots of resources, so please check out the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing. There's online trainings, there's the podcast, there's clickable tools. The Women's Housing and Homelessness Network and the Women's National Indigenous Women's Network are here. They're fantastic resources. They're great to collaborate with. And I heard this morning at the opening session that the CAEH is also going to launch a Voting for Housing Matters campaign. So that's another way you're all plugged in. You're going to be on their mailing list forever now. So you'll be hearing about that. But please use our QR codes, listen to the podcast, get in touch. We'd love to stay connected.
Awesome, and we're not going to take questions now. Stefania is going to bring up those two presentations, and then we'll do them all at the end. Thanks, everyone.
We don't like to go the easy way. Right? They gave us a stage with stairs. Where's the new one?
Thank you so much to that amazing panel. Yeah, just grateful to be in the room with you folks. Jody, your voice is captivating and calming. I can listen to you talk all day, but really that was so meaningful. Thank you all so much. And just to buy my friends some time, I'll reintroduce them. So the next presentation is Making the Invisible Unavoidable, a research and advocacy case study on getting women's homelessness on the political agenda, with Jennifer Gordon and Roz Gunn from YWCA Cambridge. Thank you both so much.
Can I still come down here? Is it gonna be like Lamb from Christmas? Okay. I just want to say this is my first workshop in the women's stream, and it has reminded me why I love this work. It's so great being with all of you. I got to fangirl out because She They Us podcast is like where I go when I'm ready to like either really give it or like really like give it in a bad way. So didn't think it through when they changed the lineup and said we could go after, but we're gonna do our best. How you feeling? Good. Okay. So my name is Jennifer Gordon. I am a consultant with Pineapple Flags, and I moonlighted for a while as a manager of advocacy and research at YWCA Cambridge. This is my colleague Roz Gunn, Director of Communications and Advocacy at YWCA Cambridge. And we are here to share how we made the invisible unavoidable, getting women's homelessness on the political agenda. This is a research and advocacy case study about Cambridge, Ontario, and some of the things that we've done for better, for worse, a little bit of an authentic look. Hopefully some of you get inspiration today, or just reassurance. One of us has to do the clicker. You want me to click? Is this that?
Yeah. There we go.
This is so tricky because I have to, okay, that's fine.
At one point, we're just gonna tell jokes.
Yeah, you didn't know, but you're actually here for a stand-up. Okay, we're on slide 2. Okay, so just a little overview here of what we're gonna discuss. This is like a real quick and dirty rundown of 2,000,003 things that we've been doing over the last couple of years. But we're gonna do our best to make it succinct and give some really, at least in our minds, key highlights. So we're going to talk a little bit about knowledge building we've done, collective leadership, taking action, then our results of some of the work that we've been doing, and then some key lessons learned. Nope. Change the slide on mine, not yours. Okay.
All right, so this is a screenshot here of what we call our coping faces. If you happen to run into us at the conference and see us in a corner making these faces,
don't talk to us.
These are panic faces. We call this the Great Crash and Burn of 2023. In advocacy, we talk about touch points. And so we talk about these moments in time that we pay extra attention to, because as we're doing long-term change, we end up in situations where we don't know if we're making an impact.
And so these are touch points that we can say, wait, I remember then, maybe we have made this tiny little step or these small incremental changes. So this screenshot was us doing a delegation in our municipal budget process. A counselor had said the words, we need a women's shelter and youth shelter in Cambridge, and we understood that as a rally call, and we showed up at the tail end of a budget process without actually having a budget ask. All we asked for was to look at a gender-based analysis plus a lens to decision-making. An example, fund women's shelter appropriately, and give us a shelter in Cambridge, a women's shelter in Cambridge. In case our faces really don't send it home for you, it did not go well. It did not land. I know, it's okay, we got even, guys, just stick with us. The message did not land, and there was some aggressive attitude that came our way. So when we talk about knowledge building, from this experience, we knew that there was a lot that we needed to share about women's homelessness in our community. Up until this point, there hadn't been even an active acceptance that women's homelessness was different than men's homelessness in the community, never mind the context how we do decision making around that. So we knew in order to make change, we had to start building those knowledge blocks, and how we did that was through community-led research. So some of you might be familiar. I've presented on this project before here a couple of years ago, but in case not, Project Willow was published in 2022. We engaged 63 women experiencing homelessness or recently had been homeless through surveys and interviews in Waterloo Region. Some of these women were from Cambridge or had context of experiences across the region. However, we knew for our project, and very specifically focusing in on this community, we couldn't just pull the data. We ended up with too few people, which then we all know if you have too few people, it doesn't matter their experience because there's too few people. We can discredit that very quickly. So what we did was actually take a look at the voices that did inform this report, and we said, what in this report is probably amplified in our community from the perspective of services missing and other things. So we pulled out some stats. So the first one was that 44% of those who participated in the survey were actually experiencing at least one episode of gender-based violence daily. So we really started to double down and say there is an intersect between gender-based violence and homelessness that does not just start with experiences of violence that lead to homeless. There is violence that happens while homeless as well. We also pulled out on the stat of 65% avoided services because of fear of running into an abuser. This was magnified in our community because often there was only one service option. So the odds of running into that person, if there's only one coffee shop and everybody wants a coffee, you're probably gonna have to risk more. So more women weren't showing up. 73% avoided co-ed shelter. I cannot send this home enough. I make a joke about death to co-ed shelter. Feels like a crowd I can say that to. But the problem was that our community only ever had a co-ed shelter. And so actually when this report came out, that shelter said, you know what, we're not doing right by women. And that led the way for an opportunity for women's shelter to come in, because we were no longer treating that community as that's enough. It was now there's nothing. So that was really appreciated. And lastly, because of the lack of services, we have a deep-seated issue around women's hidden homelessness. And so when we talk about 84% stayed in abusive housing situations because it felt safer than being homeless, that was something that allowed us to push back against the forever lovely stat of how many women are experiencing homelessness. So we use Project Willow that way. I have a theory. So my theory is that when we use statistics, it will inform decision making. But in order to change social change, you have to have quotes. And so we doubled down on some quotes that we knew were from women connected to the community that we were advocating for. Two of these quotes ended up being really strong messages that we used again and again. And they were, there's no real safe place in community. And I think I'm so nervous everywhere because I have been humiliated so badly in the last 6 months. So when they were not listening to the data, they got to listen to the stories. So when, still me.
I saw you winding down like nobody.
No, get back in line. Appreciated. So when we first launched Project Willow, it was June in the year of an election year. And we were on a 2-year project with Wage, and we said, can we really afford 5 months where we miss momentum. And I know we've all probably, even right now, are struggling with that, with pending elections and everything else going on. So we said, how do we do this? Because we can engage our current decision makers in this conversation, but we have no proof that in 4 months they're still going to be our decision makers. Or we can wait, in which case we have to wait for a new council, that council to get, acclimated. We saw what happened to our coping phases with that council. So we preemptively decided what we were going to do was actually invite all the political candidates that were running for city and municipal government, every last one of them, in a group email, so they all felt a little bit of pressure. We said, here's some social graphics, you show up, you can share this in your campaign, played to some egos, and then I said, I will stay on this call until you have exhausted this subject. I was there for an extra hour and a half while people continued to ask questions, challenge, everything else. And that was my commitment to say, if we're having an election and we're about to lose our decision makers, then the least we can do is try and engage the new ones. So yes, we pandered to people who were already most likely gonna support these social issues. However, we also found when people weren't elected, often people who run for government, I'm sure our last panel can attest to this, are people who are also holding leadership roles in community in some sort of way. So they traveled with this knowledge to all of their little pockets.
Ready? Yeah. Okay, so then this takes us to another research project we did. So we have for many years been calling Cambridge a service desert. I don't know if everyone in the room is familiar with Waterloo Region, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo. And it's very well established, especially for those of us who live or work in Cambridge, that services are often concentrated in Waterloo and Kitchener, and the assumption is that they're also available to people who live in Cambridge. But the accessibility by transit between or among the Tri-Cities, particularly between Cambridge and KW, is garbage. So if the service exists in Waterloo or Kitchener, it does not mean, and it actually tends to happen that people living in Cambridge are not accessing, or not having access to that service. So we knew Cambridge was a service desert, but we wanted to show it. And as Jen mentioned earlier, we didn't have strong representation of living experience voices for women experiencing homelessness in Cambridge. And we also didn't have the resources to do more robust research with women experiencing homelessness. So we did the next best thing and gathered voices from the service providers, the frontline workers, and even elected representatives to produce this community-based research. So this research paper brought together all the voices to actually show the gaps in the systems, and there are so many, a glaring one being, and this is the one we say again and again and again, that there is no homeless shelter beds dedicated to women in Cambridge. So to this point, our research has helped us show one thing, that women's homelessness is different from men's homelessness, but we needed to show another, that the services required to respond to it just don't exist in Cambridge. So we had some key learnings throughout this research. They're up there on the slide. Nothing here is surprising to anyone doing the work, but some people really just need a fancy research report to feel legitimate. So Cambridge does not have the services or infrastructure in place to address and end homelessness. There are uneven allocations of funding felt at the regional level, no shade at the regional staff, and there is a need for increased commitments from upper levels of government. So really saying this is not one government who is responsible for responding to this adequately. It is all levels of government who have responsibilities here. Services trying to support women who do come forward admit that they are not the solution or necessarily the right organization to be providing the support. So a lot of us are working off the sides of our desks trying to support individuals who are accessing our services for any number of reasons. But the work that these folks that we're all doing is not funded and not adequately resourced. And then an equity lens in terms of gender, culture, disability, and race is severely lacking in Cambridge, and this is leading to considerations around human rights. I think that's it. Okay, so this is a graphic from that report, and anyone who's done advocacy, I think you kind of learn quickly that graphics go a long way, especially if they tell a pretty impactful message. So this graphic here, we use this just to showcase how much of a service desert Cambridge is, and what exactly is lacking. And everything is lacking there, to be honest. Beautiful city, lots of really old and gorgeous churches. So we wanted to send the message home that Cambridge is a service desert, and we wanted to visualize it. And this graphic, we've gotten a lot of steam in our advocacy because we hear the crowds always say when we show this. just that wow, that collective wow. Because you can say there are no services and people can say that must suck, but when you but look at what there is in the region and none of that is in Cambridge, it finally gets that message sent home. I just need to change my slide. I wish we had a monitor. Oh, it's there. Okay, it's fine. Okay, so just some quotes. So as Jen said, we have that belief that quotes really add sort of color and context to any research you're doing or advocacy you're doing. So this one quote from a service provider: "We believe that as a community we can and should wrap these individuals in care and support to avoid violence and further traumatization. We can work together to create a community that properly supports women." And then we also had quotes from politicians. And we'll speak a little bit about that later, but so this particular politician said, "By establishing a gender-based violence responsive emergency shelter within Cambridge, we are sending a clear message that we stand with these women and are committed to their well-being." And I'm still going, okay, 10.
You want me to click?
Yes, please, thank you.
Up.
10. Okay, so a little bit more about, all of this work that we've been doing, it's not like we had a master plan when we started this out. It's just that, wow, women's homelessness isn't discussed enough. The differences among women's experiences of homelessness are not well understood. And the fact that hidden homelessness is the most pervasive form of homelessness among women is not well understood. Women aren't visible, therefore their homelessness isn't a problem, and therefore it's not being addressed. So we just were like, all right, every avenue, every channel we can use to get this message out there, we're going to do it. So we had a podcast, very briefly, not the same caliber, not the same caliber as GDIS.
We had something that seemed like a podcast.
It was a grassroots podcast, let's call it that. But anyway, so interviewing the former CEO of YWKW and then current and long-standing CEO of YW Cambridge, long serving advocates in the realm of women's homelessness. It's another channel to use. We also, of course, use social media, get the messaging out there, put it in pretty graphics. Lots of people like sharing their issues. I think it was, you were saying just this was the easy activism, but sharing it to your story, it's easy, but it still helps spread the message, right? So every little bit counts. And then, of course, traditional media, so we'd write opinion pieces anywhere for any outlet who would take us. Yeah, I guess that's it on that. Now it's you.
The men found us, guys.
I think you can play it with the computer.
What?
I was doing great, just.
All right, well, the next thing we're going to talk about is building collective leadership. So it figures. So collective leadership is something that really speaks to the YWCA Cambridge, their approach, culture, and brand. And it's this idea of bringing together shared ownership, shared voice, and shared commitment, whether that's in an ongoing way or for a temporary goal. So here we are. Hypothetically, maybe.
We're there.
Okay. So back to the Women's Homelessness in Cambridge report. So this report always acted as our secondary piece to reinforce our Project Willow research. But one of the things that's really uncommon in community-led research is the ability to bring together across dynamics. And what I mean by that is that we had academics come into this. We had folks that were working in outreach roles on the front line, nonprofit leadership. And we also had some political officials who came in a very authentic way and said, you know what, we want to show up in a way for our community this way. So this was really how we started to come together in such a way that we could share a voice that was more unavoidable because it was organized. We came up with 6 very obvious, but you've heard the context of where we're starting from. Very obvious but important change areas. This sort of became our contract together, and really this is the report where we started to collectively, as organizations, say, no, we're in a service desert, which, sometimes when we say that, people are like, but I exist. But our community was like, no, this is our opportunity to say, there is nothing, help us, we are a service desert. And that language is something we've been able to really travel with in a way that has caused people to have to pay attention.
And so another aspect of just getting the message out there was we hosted a 3-part panel series on women's homelessness, and one of them engaged Cambridge politicians. And one of the reasons why we did this panel event was there is a loud minority in Cambridge that isn't exactly pushing for just policy responses to rising homelessness, and that is the understatement of the century. But we wanted to continue pushing against those narratives and showing just what alternatives can look like, how we can achieve them, and that there are people in power who are listening, and that they don't buy into the harmful and dehumanizing rhetoric. So both the work of the research report and in particular this panel of elected representatives made us realize something pretty cool, and that is often advocacy, especially that done by sort of scrappier grassroots organizations, is often like going at politicians. You're not doing this, you should do this. And instead of assuming that we're just going at our governments, we figured, all right, well, let's pick our allies, show that there actually is political support out there, and capitalize on that. Leverage it, I guess you could say. And yes, we've been saying we cherry-picked our supporters, of course. We have that prerogative, so we did. We picked the supporters who are going to speak to policy alternatives and interventions that we want to see that are more just and equitable.
One of the things I like about this project is that we didn't initially ask these folks to be a part of it. We put an open invite out to everybody who had connected with us. And we had these politicians come forward and say, we want to be a part of this. And we were like, okay, a second webinar, which was kind of a cool reinforcement for us as well.
Next slide. Taking action. That's you, isn't it?
We're taking action now.
Oh, that's still me.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. We did practice, I swear. Okay, so something that we've been doing the last couple of years and that has really been feeding into a lot of the work that we've been doing is convening, we don't have a name. We call ourselves the ad hoc committee. We don't know. Every time we schedule a meeting in the calendar, that's a different name. But people show up. They still know why they're coming. So we wanted to mobilize the community, break down some of those silos that are hindering a lot more collaboration among organizations. And so we did have around 27 meetings, and this was over 2023, I think, more than 27 meetings with either organizational leadership or political leadership. We gathered more than 30 organizations in this ad hoc committee, and originally when we struck this committee, it was really just to push for a women's shelter in Cambridge, but it became a collaborative and a knowledge sharing opportunity. And we even just, some cool things came out of this. Staff from the emergency department in the local hospital attended these meetings, and they said, well, you know, we release a lot of women, or what's the word? The word, you know, discharge a lot of women to no fixed addresses. And they said, well, we can start collecting data on that, so you actually have a good idea, because increasingly women are using emergency departments as warm places to go. And then, yes, this ad hoc group. So I guess that's all I have to say about that, because we're tight on time. But in any case, the collaboration has been incredibly fruitful, and we are still working quite hard in our advocacy efforts, and we have some really exciting plans coming up.
So as, I'm like the bad news bearer now, as we were securing the opportunity for shelter in Cambridge, which would have allowed us to have 2 shelters, one in each of our urban centers, we got some tough news that the KW Women's Shelter was shutting down, which eventually went from potentially 2 great shelters to no shelters. And that's something that our community is still grappling with right now as winter comes close. This became awkward because it's one thing to advocate to politicians, it's one thing to go to decision makers, but when we have to advocate for decisions as peers, it becomes messy. And so this was an opportunity where our ad hoc group was like, we want to say something about this, how do we do this? And luckily our academics said, I think I can handle this. And so we had academics who decided to lend their voice to this storyline, which removed the politics of decision makings that agencies are able to do, and has since been a strategy that continues to move in those very awkward moments where you're like, we really want to, but the payoff and the timing is hard. Our academics were able to come together and say, how do we do this, which is something that I really treasure.
Okay, so just real quick, with this ad hoc group, a smaller group broke off and said, no, let's actually do some advocacy, let's do something. And so this group drafted an open letter and outlined all the different things various levels of governments and members of public can do to advance the right to housing for everyone. These are all the organizations that signed on to that letter. It got quite a great pickup in the media. It was really well received. And actually staff at the region said, I know you plan on releasing this in 2 weeks, but can you release it next week? Because there's actually going to be a discussion at council that this could have a really positive impact on. So yes, we did, of course, with pleasure. And yeah, I think that's it. So what happened?
What happened? So let's go back to that slide where we're both about to like completely break down. Yep. There it is. So you'll remember that our ask was a gender-based analysis lens to be used in decision-making and to fund women's shelter appropriately and in Cambridge. So that's where we started.
This is me. So while all this advocacy continues, we have had a significant win. YWCA Cambridge secured operating funding, capital support, and a location for a temporary shelter. And it feels like we've been shot out of a cannon because we are working very hard to have this open before the winter, this winter. And we're just lucky that the region that we were working with, the contractors and the architects are all on the same page, and we will do whatever it takes to make this happen.
First time in 40 years of advocacy, by the way. Legacies of advocacy.
So yes, there is no plan to let up on the advocacy because this is going to be a 20-bed shelter, 24/7 model. It's going to be great. However, a 20-bed shelter does not a complete solution make. So one thing though that we fixed, I guess that we felt or that was really interesting for us was before we announced this shelter, we were warned to brace for impact. We were told, oof, you'd better have some crisis comms ready. People are going to be so mad about this. The NIMBYs are coming for you. We did a meal drop with the region, led by the region, within 500-meter radius. We did the news release went out. We did all the comms announced in the shelter, and not a single angry phone call, angry email. There are no angry rioters at our doors. There are a couple of councillors who have their own. They don't matter. They're not that loud. Generally speaking, the reception has been really positive, and rather than people calling us and saying, I don't want you to destroy the character of my neighborhood, we're actually having people call and say, how can I support?
So as we were doing this sort of community building around our grassroots work, there was actually a pretty big movement in our region called the Plan to End Chronic Homelessness. And this is a rework about how we're going to reach functional zero by 2030 as a community. There's a presentation tomorrow if you get all inspired. But one of the things that we decided as a group was that at every single one of these meetings, at least one of us was going to be there, probably two of us, and we were going to bring up gender equity anytime it remotely was relevant, which was all the time because we were working from a deficit. So we did that monthly, again and again and again and again and again, and we were louder and quieter, and sometimes the only voice, and sometimes giggles, because it was like, I have something, and everyone knew what it was going to be. However, look at those 1.1 and 1.3 folks, our shining moments. You see that GBA plus? We now have that in our services and programs and our policy review coming from this action plan. So this is how our community is going to correct itself and move forward, and gender equity is unavoidable in it. All right, so we come full moment here. This is where we are. And so this is a delegation one of our community partners did from United Way, because they joined in on us.
Notice we didn't volunteer to do the delegation.
Yeah, no, this was that awkward moment. However, in that delegation, all of a sudden one of the regional councillors said, well, how, because we went for gender-based analysis decision-making again, clearly, right? Anyone who has an advocacy vendetta brings that back when the opportunity's there. And we had the question, how can I do that? How can I make decisions from that gender-based analysis lens? And it was an awesome moment, but again, we were wildly unprepared. So a little reminder to everybody who's working towards something, you can put a lot of effort into trying to get to that change, but be aware that you also have to plan for the shift for when that change does happen. However, luckily we had maybe kind of podcast, as well as some op-eds and other things that we were working on around feminist city issues that we were able to start that counselor off with the commitment that we will come back to you with more information and opportunities soon.
And we are way over time, but this is the last substantive slide. Just some key lessons learned throughout this work. I'll read them very quickly. Sometimes it's just a lack of organizers. Be the organizer. Relationships are key when working with decision makers. Even if you don't like the guy, you really got to have that relationship. Saying the same thing gets you to the 100 monkeys faster. That's Jem's phrase. Apparently it is a phrase, an idiom, but I don't know it. Anyway, just repeat, repeat, repeat. Diversify voices, perspectives, and power to maximize opportunities in every space. Keep a macro and micro lens active for short-term and long-term goals. Like I said, this was not a whole coordinated 2-year plan. This was like, just got to get this on the agenda, just got to get this on the agenda. So keep that macro focus. Don't be over-prescriptive, be flexible, and drop the ego. You might be thinking something's the best thing to do, and others in the room think that that's not the best thing to do. So be open to have that conversation. Leadership tip, foster trust and autonomy. We've been really lucky that the leader of our organization, Kim Decker, is an incredible leader that just fosters autonomy on the team. She leads and leans into her own strengths and says, if that's what you think is important that you want to put your time into, go for it. And then another leadership tip, as Jen just suggested, be ready for movement at points of success. So as I said, this has felt like we've been shot out of a cannon. We thought in fall of 2023, yeah, I guess if no one else, then who? I guess it's us. Let's try to open a women's shelter, and now we're trying to open it before this winter. But it's all exciting, and we just decided that we're holding hands and jumping off the cliff. And this is us, and how to get in touch with us. Where to find us, I changed my slide now. That's us. And how to find us, how to get in touch with us. We never said who YWCA Cambridge is, so if you don't know, look for that logo. We're YWCA.
Thanks so much.
No stairs, I just don't want to. I want to jump in.
Oh, thanks, Mama.
Thank you both so much. That was amazing. Although, I'm looking forward to the day where feminist organizations don't always have to be scrappy and living in a resource deficit, but it's amazing what we can achieve when we really put our minds to it and work together. I'm really pleased to now introduce our next presentation. Ontario Coalition of Women's Supportive Housing and Shelter Services Providers with Sumi Chang from Street Haven at the Crossroad and Corey Roslin from the Elizabeth Fry Society of Northeastern Ontario.
Greetings. I'm delighted to be presenting at this conference. Corey and I are delighted to be here. As mentioned, my name is Sumi Chang. I'm the Executive Director of Street Haven. Street Haven is a multi-service women's agency. We're actually award-winning. We actually have the historical distinction of having established Canada's first women's shelter in downtown East Toronto. We also operate several supportive care housing units, as well as operating only one of 4 addictions residential treatment programs for women only in Toronto, making it only a total of 84 beds in all of Toronto. And we operate employment and training services and mental health services. Before I jump in, I'm just going to ask Corey to introduce herself too.
Thank you, Sumi. I'll actually do it from here just so we
don't have to
jump back and forth. Hi, everyone. My name is Corey Roslin. I'm the Executive Director of the Elizabeth Fry Society of Northeastern Ontario. I'm located in Sudbury, way up north to most people, but not that north if you actually are from the north. We operate our services on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Atikameksheng people in Robinson Huron Treaty Territory. And for those of you who don't know, the Elizabeth Fry Society is an organization that focuses on women and gender diverse people, primarily those people that are interacting with or being criminalized by the justice system. And because that is our focus, we also offer many services that try to support people where their needs or their life experiences have led them to that intersection. So housing and homelessness is, of course, one of those factors that really intersect with the justice system. And I have to say briefly, sorry, Sumi, I was really inspired and just felt so connected to the previous presentation because that story is very, very similar to the story of how Elizabeth Fry started a shelter in Sudbury just over 2 years ago. We responded to a call from the city stating, we need more shelter beds. Will a service provider come forward and support offering those shelter beds over a 5-month period just to get us through this winter, because housing is not going to be an issue after this winter, right? I was in that meeting and I said, yes, absolutely, we will do it, but we will only do it if it is a shelter that is only supporting women and gender diverse people and not a co-ed shelter. And the great thing that happened is that the city listened and they responded and supported us to do that. It was supposed to be a 5-month thing. We have now been operating for just over 2 years, and that led me to meeting Sumi and being a part of this coalition. And we are now moving that shelter to expand from the 10 beds that we have been supporting to 26 beds starting in December. So like you, the YWCA, we're just jumping off and figuring it out. So advocacy can and does work, and there are those moments.
Yeah. All right. Congrats, Corey, and congrats to those of you in Cambridge. So for this last presentation, we wanted to talk to you about the Ontario Women's Coalition of Shelter and Supportive Housing Providers. Just talk a little bit about the origins, who we are, what we're wanting to accomplish, and just kind of what our aspirations and challenges are. So the coalition is actually a coalition of women's agencies in Ontario that operate shelter and supportive care housing for women only, or those who identify as women. This coalition is actually comprised of a group of women's agencies across Ontario representing the North, Central, and Eastern Ontario. And these agencies are actually led by women leaders and management members. I thought I'd give a little bit of an acknowledgement and shout out to some of our members who may or may not be here today, but Louise from Cardi House, if she's here, Beth from Nelson House, if she's here, Shannon from Cornerstone for Women, if she's here, and lastly, I do know she's here, Megan from Eat Fries and Muskoka, quietly waving her hand in the middle. So some of us were really keen on coming to Ottawa and just meeting with the Ottawa group. We as a coalition have been meeting virtually, so we haven't really had an opportunity. I think I've only met Corey once in person, so it's nice to see her again. Just to give a little bit of our origin, so really it really started out with myself and the executive director for Cornerstone for Women. We came together in Ottawa and we met and really had a discussion about how both of our respective women's agencies seemed really challenged by common issues. One was the underinvestment in women's only housing, which we heard of today. The underinvestment in women's only shelter services, which we also heard of today. I know that, Toronto seems very resource rich, but even within that kind of network of shelter services, there is a disproportionate number of women's only shelters. And I have to say, like co-ed shelters, it makes me internally cringe when, policy leaders and decision makers are like, well, we've invested in co-ed services, that should be okay, right? So I totally get what was said earlier. The last piece, which was also mentioned in the first presentation, was this whole poor funding structure that a lot of the women's agencies suffer from. Certainly Cornerstone for Women, a Street Haven, our agencies and Corey's agencies, we all are really underfunded from our various parties, local, provincial, and federal. We all carry structural deficits on behalf of the government because it seems okay for them to have us fundraise on their behalf to operate public services. And which is yet another thing that also really gets my hackles up. And the other piece is just the heavy workload that we all seem to be burdened with as women's agencies. And there was really this strong desire between our two agencies to see if we could come together and create a network of women's agencies that shared these common issues, but also shared some common goals and desires when it came to the broader system in Ontario and trying to influence policy leaders. So Street Haven and Cornerstone for Women became the original co-founders for this coalition. And we sent really a broad invitation out to to all of our respective networks and colleagues and allies and friends of various women's agencies across Ottawa, Toronto, and beyond. And we held our first meeting in 2022 to really discuss what would be the purpose, why would we want to meet, what would be the goals, and to be perfectly frank, what would also be feasible for the coalition. All of the agencies who had attended that day expressed an interest in wanting to be a part of the coalition, but really cautioned against just meeting for the sake of meeting. And I think we can all appreciate those kinds of meetings. So we drafted up a terms of reference, which really identified and outlined some of the most essential objectives that we wanted to ensure that the coalition met, so that we felt that our time was being used wisely, with many of us having so many competing priorities, and frankly, the coalition really operating at times, unfortunately, off the side of our desk. So there were really two key goals that were of interest to us. One was to engage in advocacy to raise awareness and the need for more investment in women's shelter and supportive housing in Ontario. And the second was to engage in knowledge transfer and exchange in order to first optimize our collective actions and enhance our impact. And secondly, to just increase our knowledge about each other's services. Even though there's so few of us across the province, we don't seem to know each other that well. And it's probably because we're all burdened with a lot of work and not enough capacity. And that is the common theme that seems to be threading all of our women's agencies in the province. And so just needing to find a platform for us to come together and just get to know each other better, and also to share knowledge about things that are working well and things that aren't working well, and trying to see if we could avoid reinventing that wheel. So I'm going to turn the stage over to Corey, who will share with you our activities and some of our accomplishments.
Thank you, Sumi. So we arranged the activities of the coalition based on our goals, of course. And in terms of engaging in advocacy and raising awareness for women's services in terms of housing, we originally focused on pre-budget consultations and submissions to both provincial and federal governments. And I attended a workshop this morning that spoke about that very issue. And while I was reassured that some of the work we've been doing actually aligned with what they were telling us we should be doing, we also got some good ideas for ways forward. So I think that's excellent. Yeah. We participated in a National Housing Day event at Queen's Park, including a press release, question period, and nonpartisan reception. And I'll show you a picture from that in a second, but it really gave us an opportunity to gather together, to make a bit of a stink in a public place, to share stories of people with lived experience, of women who are currently accessing our services or are in need of services where there are none, from organizations all across the province that are participating in the coalition. And with Sumi's leadership, we were able to compile all of those stories and have some of those stories shared in the question period at Queen's Park, but also pointed questions asked to our provincial leadership, which I'll say they did not respond to. And then we really spent some time focusing on government relations in general, learning how to do that juggle between running mainly service-focused organizations while still having priorities for advocacy and wanting things to be different than they are. And as you will see in our challenges shortly, that did prove to be difficult. And while we haven't accomplished everything that we set out to do, we are continuing to push forward with those issues. And then we have also gathered together to develop policy positions on important issues commonly faced by women, and many of them are very similar to the asks that we saw in the previous presentations from both of the groups. So that was really refreshing to see as well. And we wanted to create consistent messaging for organizations that are supporting women across the province. We wanted opportunities for people with lived experience to give input representing gender. We wanted that gender-based analysis. And we wanted our collective voice to be heard, and to be heard in a louder way than it had been in the past. And so some of those key policy messages are, of course, making significant investment in women's supportive care housing. Very specifically, we were asking for at least 30% or more of the budget towards housing to be set aside for women's supportive housing. We want target development of funds to women's nonprofit sector. We want core funding for women's organizations to be able to run run the services that we need to run, and not to be run off our feet and into the ground in order to operate those services. We want attached mental health supports for supportive care housing. And we want an advisory table on housing development composed of not-for-profit agencies, and more importantly, people who are living that experience and who have that expertise to share with people who need to hear it. And here you will see photos of us at Queen's Park. So the first event that was held in March of 2023, and then the second one on the National Housing Day of Action in November of 2023. And the second section of our goals is really about knowledge transfer and exchange in order to optimize our collective action and enhance our impact, as well as increasing knowledge of each other's services, as Sumi mentioned earlier. So we've been meeting quarterly virtually starting through COVID, and had the rare opportunity to meet in person. We're sharing resources across the province for best practices, for grant proposals, areas of expertise. If something is successful, let us replicate it so women across our province can benefit from that. We're creating a network of services province-wide to facilitate increased support for women across the sector, and generating a database of statistical information and client stories representing the scale of need across the province. I really connected to some of the information that was presented in the previous presentation. It very much mimics a lot of the situation that is happening in the community that I come from. While each community is unique, there are certain things that are consistent across the province, across our country. And the more that we can gather that information and speak with that collective voice, I think the more power it has. We're also trying to support each other in learning and supporting our frontline staff and women to develop leadership roles within our organizations. As a person who grew up in EFRI, as I like to say, I've spent my whole career working with Elizabeth Fry Society, and there isn't a ton of opportunity for advancement into leadership roles because our organizations are so flat, right? There aren't those small stepping stones toward leadership. You're a frontline staff, and then you're a coordinator of some sort, and then all of a sudden you're steering the ship and you have no idea what you're doing. And I think a lot of women in women's organizations can relate to that experience because there isn't that support in order to garner the experience that you need in order to steer that ship properly. So we're trying to do better at that by moving collectively. And our challenges, of course, which I also heard from the other presentations here, capacity and burnout and turnover in leadership within our organizations. In the 2 years that we have been meeting, half of the coalition has seen the leadership roles turn over. And so when that happens, it becomes really difficult for us to gain any momentum. We're rebuilding relationships. We're, starting from scratch in terms of building that trust and rapport. And helping each other to see the benefit of participating in yet another thing that's going to take some time and operate off the side of our desks. Of course, as we've spoken about already, the underinvestment in women's sector overall has been a huge challenge for us. The lack of dedicated administrative supports within each agency. I am the executive director. I'm also the finance director. I'm also the HR department. I am also the director of advocacy in our organization. And so it often leads us to doing a lot of things not as well as we need to be doing them. So that's been a real challenge. That work is being done off the side of our desks consistently. As well, it was spoken about earlier, the uncertainty leading to struggles with momentum and succession planning within our network. People get burnt out and they leave their roles, and they don't leave their roles in a capacity for the person behind them necessarily to be successful, because we're everything, right? And there isn't a person beside you who has all that knowledge and that experience to transfer on. And the last one, fear of advocacy work leading to reprisal. We have seen this over and over. We have felt it ourselves. Again, with that dual responsibility of service provision for our community and advocacy, we're always afraid that if we take it one step too far, someone's going to pull the rug out from underneath us. And then we won't be able to support the women that we currently are.
Thank you, Corey. So those are our challenges, but despite those challenges, we feel like we still have a lot of aspirations. There's still a lot of positive thoughts and feelings that we have towards the coalition and the impact of the coalition. We want to continue to grow the coalition and secure greater representation across the province and ensure that we have a very strong succession plan. One other key piece that we want to do is really shape government policy. We know that the policy windows are now opening with anticipated elections happening both federally and provincially. This really creates kind of windows for us to really try and hit home our message much stronger than they've been to date about the need for greater investments in women's services, especially on shelters and women's only housing. And this is where really the focus of our energies will be in the next year and a bit. And really try and present a very strong, influencing voice around investments in women's only shelter and supportive care housing. I'm really quite excited by some of the presentations from today, especially some of the pan-Canadian and national voices that are out there. I think that, these present opportunities for, future partnership. One other aspect for us is really continuing to build the capacity around advocacy, policy influence, analysis, and research. The government relations work, and of course, our National Housing Day, which is just around the corner. So this is an invite to everybody. Please come out, and if you can, to Toronto. We will be having our second annual National Housing Day, which will be scheduled on November the 21st. Please register. Just to let you know, we generally will have, as mentioned by Corey, we'll have a press conference in the morning, generally with support and partnership with the opposition party. The opposition party, what we've actually been doing is actually collating as people register. We ask agencies and individuals who've lived experience to share their own personal experiences or challenges within their agencies. We actually collate all of those stories and experiences and send them over to the opposition party. We have in the past wanted to share it out to all of the parties actually, so that everyone has access to them. And what the opposition party does is they actually present those experiences and journeys and pose them as questions on the question period floor and really kind of drill at the government of the day and just kind of ask them, why is the member of Cambridge not seeing, any housing investments in women's services, and just ask them these very targeted questions and just kind of put them on the hot seat. But as Corey says, the government's very good at deflecting and just saying all sorts of things other than, answering the question that was posed to them. But we do welcome every and all folks. You saw a few pictures. There's generally quite a good group of us. We're hoping that we'll see another big turnout, and certainly women's services and agencies and individuals who have an interest in this, we certainly would welcome you there. And it's quite organized, even though sometimes it seems a bit chaotic. We do get a lot of support from the opposition party for that. So it's an important year for us. I think we really have to make sure we present our stance and position a really strong voice on that. So with that, then Corey and I, if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them, and here are our details. So thank you so much for your time.
Panelists join us up here?
It's a lot. But whoever wants to come up can. Is this, okay, sorry. We have 10 minutes for questions, which is amazing. Kudos to every single amazing panelist and presenter, because this was jam-packed, and I do apologize. We fought for as many sessions as we could get when we were curating this stream. So maybe more next year. We'll keep fighting the CAH, who invites us here every year, but we'll do it. So I would like to open up the floor to questions. I will come to you if anybody has for the three. Yeah, Khulud in the back.
Thank you. I was able to listen to the last two presentations, but I know the first presentation pretty well, so I knew what it was about. I wanted to ask, as Stefania might have already mentioned, we're with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and I would be really interested in hearing from the panelists, like, how do we cut across different levels of government to strengthen advocacy, because we know that housing is something that's functioning at different levels of government. And it's really amazing to see municipal wins, because we know that such powerful work happens at the municipal level of the government and at the provincial level of government. So I'm really interested in hearing perspectives on how can we strengthen advocacy across different levels of government, and how can each of us sort of rise to the challenge without overburdening our very limited capacities of amplifying and building better coalitions and building better partnerships among each other.
Okay, this is awkward. I'll dive in. Just as someone who was in government, I can tell you a bit from an inside perspective. You know, I was in a government that was fighting to build housing at a time when nobody was even talking about it, right? Back in the sort of 2008, 2009 zone. We worked our butts off to get housing built with no support from the feds, active hostility actually from the feds and the province. And we never talked about women's housing. It wasn't until I left, and despite my own experiences, but despite being closely and deeply connected in community, nobody was talking about it because they were barely talking about housing, right? And so I guess the first thing I would say is don't assume the people that you're talking to have any idea about what the reality is on the ground. And even if they do, they may, like I did, feel somewhat marginalized because it's your experience. So you're like, oh, okay, well, like not everyone has this experience, so maybe it's not as ubiquitous. I'll tell you, when I was doing the podcast, which was only a year ago, 100% of the people I talked to, gender diverse folks and women, whether they were researchers, government members, or people with lived experience and masters, had experienced violence in housing, which blew me away. Like, it is a ubiquitous problem. Elected officials do not know that. And even if they've experienced, they think it's a personal thing, not something shared with their community.
I just had a question over here first, and then I think I saw one more.
Hi there. I wanted to ask the panel, where have you found success, or what tactics or approaches have you found successful to bring more genders in the room, such that this isn't viewed as a women's only issue?
I don't have a good answer to that question. That was going to be my answer. I'm not sure I've seen that success yet.
You plant them in the audience and you use a peer approach. There are 3 in here that I planted in the audience one day so a conversation wouldn't die. And it seems ridiculous, but it normalizes the story. It brings somebody to the conversation again and again and again. Thank you.
I'll say briefly, I did do a large-scale gender strategy when I was in government, and literally, as we were bringing it to the floor of council, I sent a note to the mayor. I said, you need to move this. I can't be. And he's like, I can't do that. It looked like I was stealing like 3 years of your work. And I'm like, I need you to do this so it's not a woman's issue. It's a all of us issue. Every single man spoke to it. Every councillor spoke to it, which would not have happened if it was me moving it. And they all started crying. It was quite amazing, talking about the experiences of their mothers and their wives and their daughters and their sisters. So I think it's making the space too, right? Like figuring out how we do that. And I know we've made some mantle jokes today. And so it's like, how do we make this? These are truths that we need to share when we're together, but we also need to make it not feel hostile for men in the spaces we're in as well.
I will say this though, you know, in Toronto, it's very interesting whenever I'm in a room or in a panel or in a meeting or a network, some sort of alliance meeting, you know, and I'll call it out. I'll say, like, let's just be clear here. Investments in co-ed services is not the same as investments in women's only services. And what has been interesting is that the conversation gravitates immediately to like, oh yeah, that's a health equity issue. And maybe that's, you know, maybe if that's a way to kind of get an into the conversation is highlighting the issue of health equity, right? Because hopefully most local communities and most local governments have that commitment towards greater diversity, equity, and inclusion. The women's services piece always seems to fall under the conversation around equity. And that is at least one way where, you know, I will have, you know, male leaders in those meetings that will often say, oh yeah, we definitely need to invest more. women's only services, it's recognized. But it always seems to like fall under this bucket of conversation around equity. And maybe that's the starting point of the conversation.
Amazing. So we have time for 2 more questions. So it was her and her. Sorry, we're gonna, yeah.
Mine is very quick, hopefully. Thank you so much. I took so many screenshots. It's incredible, the amount of work that you're doing. My question is straightforward. So, and it's based on the kind of work that I'm doing. It's great that we're doing gender-based analysis, GVA+. I wonder if you see room for, yes, women share common experience, but not all women are equal. So is there room for intersectional analysis in addition to GBA+? Or do you think it's gonna fly with policymakers? Or is it like, let us just finish this fight and then get to the other one? So do you see room for this?
Jen, I think you could speak really well to this, actually. But I don't think it is either or, right? You're advancing gender equity, but if, a real good feminist is an intersectional feminist and recognizes that we're not just advancing something for, I don't know, a conception of what white, able-bodied, cisgendered women. We're thinking about all women and all their diversity. And it really is, it does fall to women to advance at all forms of equity usually, because the world is built around white, male, able-bodied men. And I'm not saying this as a misanthrope or misandrist, whatever the word is. But it, frankly, just as a fact, the world is built around that. And so we're all pushing back against that.
Yeah, I'll just add, so I hate the idea of we build space and then we bring that conversation in, because very often we build space and then we ignore that conversation of intersectionality. So I'll say this, gender-based analysis, I'm sure some people in this room are like, ugh. I even go, huh? But the federal government believes in this. And so it makes it normalized across different levels of government. However, you open the door for the conversation of what gender-based analysis is as a policy, and we no longer actually can accept the idea that intersectionality and those shared experiences and those cross-references are things that we can ignore, right? So it's kind of using the trash language with the value base and expectation that we actually be accountable. And the second thing I'll say is that with our Project Willow research, we did 2. Their second project was with Coalition of Muslim Women, and it was focused on racialized women in our community. When it launched, they were not in a place to be able to walk into this work. So we led with our first report. They're now in a place, so the next wave is going to be their work, and they do not need to prove anything because the first report said, here it is. We're going to build on that now, right? So I think there's intentionality that can also come.
I will say this, and I need to put my colleague Leslie Cash on spotlight. She's the ED for the Toronto Shelter Network. But in Toronto, as rich as the resource appears to be, and as complex as the government is, the gender-based piece, the gender-based analysis piece is still pretty lacking. It's not as strong as I would like. I mean, they may disagree, but I will sit in on meetings where they share data, and I keep asking, can you stratify by at minimum gender? I'm not asking for anything really sophisticated here. I will say the one thing that has been very interesting about the intersectionality and how that's really gotten political kind of lens to it has been the issue of the refugee crisis that intersected with the homeless crisis, that intersected with the housing crisis in Toronto. And kind of that intersection, especially for women's agencies such as ourselves, where we used to serve 30% refugees, we went right up to 90% at one point. And we're down to 80%, right? So, our world really changed significantly with just the space of a year and a half. And that actually really got attention at the local level, at the provincial level, and at the federal level, because there was the bun fight of that's their problem, no, that's their problem, and they just finger pointed at all different levels. But it really raised the attention around, for women's agencies to say, especially for women, they are fleeing violence. When we hear from our therapists that, they're suffering from trauma because they experienced significant violence from their country of origin, that has really spotlighted the intersectionality piece between women's only services and why co-ed services don't work.
I love that I'm branded.
Just why co-ed services don't work, especially for these women who've experienced that kind of those experiences and those situations. So I do find, especially right now, and again, this policy window piece of opening up and just the crisis, and we don't want to take advantage of a crisis, but this crisis is happening right now, and I think that presents another opportunity for us to really, go after some key messages.
Yeah, I think think we've been suffering from a one-size-fits-all approach for so long, so our approach can't be one size. So I'm just going to go to our final question.
Thank you. This was super refreshing. My name is Ariel Troster. I'm actually city councilor here in Ottawa. I represent one of the downtown wards, not far from here, epicenter of homelessness in one of Ontario's largest cities. What I would invite you to do is to think about what you're doing better and differently. Because I have to say in Ottawa, the shelters and supportive housing services for women and gender diverse people, for example, our traditional men's shelters that have been here forever, they do the thing where they kick people out at 9 in the morning, and then we have a large mobile population of extremely unwell people who wander the streets. And, you know, there's social disorder and complex addiction issues, and the root of the problem is they get kicked out at 9 in the morning and have nowhere to go. The women's emergency shelters don't do that. Cornerstone Housing for Women doesn't do that. And so when we opened our physical distancing centers during the pandemic and our overflow shelters that are primarily serving asylum seekers, we don't do that, right? People can stay if they need to. There might be certain hours where the places are cleansed, but they're not kicked out all day. And so I think that's a perfect example of how leadership from women's shelters and women's emergency shelters can give us a clue into how to improve the whole system. And so, you know, I'd be really interested to hear from you what you think you're doing differently that can improve the whole system overall, because I think women are doing it better. And so how can we carry that? And also, yeah, in Ottawa, fully 60 to 70% of our entire shelter system are now newcomers, 90 to 100% of our overflow system. And among our youth homelessness service providers, they say about 50% of youth experiencing homelessness are from the 2S LGBTQ community. So intersectionality is really key. Thank you.
It's a great, there are many thoughts going through my head. I guess what I might put on the table too is that in my experience, women's shelters do definitely they understand that it's not about housing, it's about home, right? And creating that space in a very intuitive way. I would posit, I haven't been in every shelter, but that the Indigenous housing providers, Indigenous women's are like much further ahead again. So to the intersectional point, like looking beyond sort of the one size fits all into some of the community care-based ones that are just doing incredible things to stabilize people's lives.
You know, to that point, I have to say, when I think about and I hear about other shelters, not women's shelters, what I would say, especially when we sit on the coalition table and we hear from each other and the services that we provide, in almost every conversation, we never only talk about shelter or only housing. Like in almost every conversation, we're always talking about the integration of various other health and social services. They're never in isolation. I actually feel like that's what we do really well in the women's sector when it comes to provision of care. We don't, like our vision mission statements, for instance, at our agency, it's not about like housing only or shelter only. Our discussion is about independence and how we help women towards a journey of independence. And that includes providing with training and employment supports and helping them with justice-related matters, or helping them with dealing with acculturation and settling in Canada and a totally different, set of values and norms here. I think that's our strength, and I feel like that's something we should really continue to promote and push. I just came from another conference out in Calgary about integrated care. And when I talked about how we were supporting homeless women who had addictions challenges, providing them with integrated health and social care, one person in the audience was like, "Oh my God, I love everything you just said." I could scream, and it was kind of like an example of, I don't know that people know the world we live in, how complex it is, and how we are working at all points of intersectionality on all sorts of issues, right?
Well, I don't want to put Jody on the spot. I know we're at time, but I might, if Jody wanted to say something or encourage people to talk to Jody, who is running one of only 2 transgender shelters in the country that does things quite differently. And into like when you, like the word safety takes on just a much deeper meaning. And I think the way you described the work, Jody, if you want to share it, that'd be great.
Thank you. Thanks. So I do have to say, the shelter that I run is an emergency weather shelter, and it is the only shelter that I know of in North America outside of Mexico City exclusively for the transgender, diverse, and two-spirit community. So it's so needed because So many trans people go to a shelter and they're forced to go to a shelter based on their gender assigned at birth, not their true gender. We have people coming into the shelter that never imagined they could feel safe in a shelter. We've got so many people on the street that won't go to shelters because they're harassed, assaulted, abused in the shelters. So, and as far as the SRO goes, having an SRO exclusively for transgender, diverse, and two-spirit people has created an incredible community there, an incredible feeling of safety. A lot of times when we're out in the community, we get harassed, we get at the least harassed, assaults. We have to worry every time we walk down the street. So to be able to come home and coming to a building where you feel safe and you're comfortable to be yourself, you're comfortable to explore, that just means more than I can describe to you. And we need more of that. So when we talk about the intersectionality, that affects us so much as well. And when we talk about women's housing, we need to talk about gender diverse housing in addition to the women's housing, because we're not always safe in women's housing either. So we need more exclusive gender diverse housing as well. And I had one more thought and I just lost it.
Where are you located? Are you in Vancouver?
Vancouver, yes. And I think that's all I have to say.
That is time. Can we just please give another round of applause to everyone who presented? This has been so inspiring. I encourage you to continue attending the Women's Homelessness Stream. Let's show them that it's so popular. We need like 10 at least. I just wanted to quickly plug the Women's Network and our sister National Indigenous Women's Housing Network. We're doing a very informal meet and greet tomorrow, 10 a.m. in room 105. No presentation. We just have like postcards and business cards, and we're just gonna chat and like share. And if you want to join us, that'd be so cool. Everyone, thank you so much for coming today.